Hello and welcome to Sex Garage. I'm your host, Shawn, Dearn, and this is the first episode in my new series, Queer Legends, an oral history podcast. It's about the people who built the rainbow, created space, and held their own. This story takes place in Montreal at a time when the village was not full of rainbows and our community felt like it was under siege. Take care of yourself as you listen to this. It includes detailed accounts of Montreal Police brutality against queer Quebecers. We begin with Montreal writer, journalist, and media pundit Richard Burnett and Concordia University professor Karen Herland, who was a self-described anarchist back in 1989 and the leader of Réaction Sida, the city's very first AIDS organization.
See, the village had only really started to move east from downtown, I guess, in the mid-'80s, late 70s, early 80s, but there was the raid on Buds in 1984. That was really the last straw. And I think it was like 125 men were charged with being in the common body house. And that's when the move east really started to happen. And the village was then called the village after Le Cinéma du Village. That's the National Theatre today. That was owned by Bernard Rousseau, who used to run Priap in the village.
There was definitely, the gay village was a male space when I was coming out, for sure. And we would sometimes go there, but, my experience was usually sitting on a terrace waiting forever for service while all the men sitting around me were getting their third round, right?
And so I kind of remember the scene was very segregated. The boys' places didn't welcome women. The women's spaces did not welcome the boys.
It was just kind of an invisibility. The bars were very segregated. And I would underscore, not just were they segregated men, women, but they were segregated, how can I put this, sort of masculine and feminine, in that a lot of men's bars, I don't know if anyone's told you this yet.
When you would walk into a bar like Cox, which used to be on René Lévesque and, oh my God. Montcalm, thank you. You go down the basement and there was a portrait of like the Queen of England.
They had a big poster of a dollar bill with a slash through the Queen.
And it'd be like a red slash across her face.
They didn't want anyone effeminate in the space, or they discouraged that.
It's kind of nothing remotely feminine was welcome into the club. No queens, no perfume, no, it was really, the village was not the greatest or the most pleasant place to hang out in. And so you would have parties like Sex Garage, where all the people that were kind of not welcome in gay bars in the village would kind of congregate. So you'd have all the butch dykes and all the femme boys and all the drag queens. Believe it, back in those days, the drag queens were not superstars like they are today.
I went to Sex Garage.
Sex Garage happened July 1990.
I was there, and I know what happened. I saw what happened.
That's Claude Filius. He created the wildly popular hot chocolate events back in the 1990s for the black queer community.
It was 4 o'clock in the morning on the corner of Beaver Hill and de la Gauchetière. You have about 500, 600 people dressed in a warehouse garb, which basically means almost nothing. Like just shorts, sweat, dance, party.
Now, Sex Garage wasn't in a bar district either, was it?
No, Sex Garage was basically, it was in a warehouse. It was an artist co-op, you could say. And my friends brought me there, and it was insane. It was just like debauchery. It was just, the music was, it was just at the time. You had to be there during that time to understand it.
Guess who wasn't understanding it? Montreal Police.
And I'm really getting into it, and then a crew comes in, and my brother, who was there, surprisingly, probably the only straight guy there, and he was just like, we got to get out of here now. Like, why? Because like, look at those guys. I said, what? They came to party. He's like, yeah. You're going to come to a warehouse party in moccasins? In loafers? And I was like, uh-huh. Okay. So we left, and by the time we got downstairs, there was like about 20, 25 police cars.
I was into my world. I was just grooving in music and dancing and connecting with the people. So I really didn't realize what was going on until like way, way later when people were running out of the building, basically. I was like, what's going on?
This is Blaine Charles, known as Blaine Mosley or Mocha Sheena. Blaine is a true gay legend, and in 1989, as part of ACT UP New York, he helped Karen Herland of Réaction Sida and Toronto's AIDS Action Now seize the stage of the 5th International AIDS Conference in Montreal. Blaine stayed for a few years after the conference. He founded ACT UP Montreal with Michael Hendricks, and he helped revolutionize the way that activism was done in Montreal and across Quebec. Then he moved to Paris, and he was a celeb on the runways of Paris as well as in Montreal's club scene. He co-founded the World Ball for Unity the same year that Black and Blue started, and Blaine was a regular entertainer at Sex Garage.
And it happened so fast. It was just like all of a sudden I'm dancing on the box, and then I'm like now like running and fighting and pushing cops off people and getting what is those plastic ties that I didn't like knocked on the ground, and then they were pushing us outside. And then once we got outside, they should have just let us go, but they didn't. So that's where the harassment happened.
Before the raid even started, Montreal police attacked and beat up a gay man between two parked cars just outside. It was witnessed by friends from an adjacent balcony, and word of that attack got around quickly.
They were hitting and beating, and it was terrible. But definitely, it was just like a really awful. Because I mean, a lot obviously, like, let's be real, a lot of us was either drunk or stoned or whatever. So we didn't have our 100% wits with us, you know. So, and I think that was the thing that they were trying to like use as an excuse for the abuse. It's like, oh, you know, this is after hours, and, you know, there's drugs, and it's, you know, alcohol, and blah, blah, blah.
I emerged from the place through the door, and there were about 32 cops, and they were kind of standing in formation, like 3 deep, blocking one side of the road.
So you come out of there, and what do you feel when you see that? Suddenly a wall of cops. I mean, this isn't the first time the Sex Garage has happened.
I know, it didn't make any sense, really, because nothing was going on, as far as I was concerned, that really warranted that.
Allow me to introduce Linda Dawn Hammond. She was an accidental hero early that morning. Her courageous photos of Montreal police attacking queer partygoers, putting herself in harm's way, and then her instinct to take those photos to the media right away sparked something incredible. This is the turning point in the struggle for queer equality in Quebec.
People knew that someone had been attacked, right? And so started confronting the police to a degree, like saying, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And assuming that it was homophobic, because it was pretty obvious that it was, because they started saying things that were homophobic towards the crowd, you know, and doing things like stroking their, the matraque.
For those of you who don't speak French, a matraque is a billy club.
Stroking it as if it was like a penis and saying, you like this, don't you? You want this, you know, which is a little bit aggressive, don't you think?
A little bit.
So what happened was, I guess they were kind of disturbed by the crowd, because a lot of people were in various states of undress, and that was, you know, something that they had a hard time accepting, I suppose. And one of the people in our crowd at one point mooned a cop.
I've heard that there were 2 moons, and that sort of was the sort of like what lit the fuse, I guess.
I'd say that was, from what I heard later from one of the police who had been there, he had mentioned that one of your guys showed their asses to us.
And so that was their excuse to start moving in?
Well, it was part of it, yeah, definitely. So the cops started moving in. At this point, the cops started to remove their identification badges in front of us, and like staring us down and removing their badges. And when that happened, we knew that something was going to happen, which we hadn't really expected up until that point, you know. But once they remove their ID, you know, they're planning on something that they don't want people to witness, or at least
be able to identify the ones who do.
Yeah, be able to identify them. Yeah. Well, you know, it was kind of fortunate that I was there, I suppose, and I had my camera, and it was professional equipment, and I had a decent flash. But unfortunately, my batteries were starting to fade because I've been shooting. And, you know, in those days, I didn't have a power pack with me or anything. So anyway, that was an issue, because I had to wait for them to recharge. So when I was shooting this, when I started shooting, I would have to take a photograph and then wait as the thing whirred, going around.
And so each time you take a shot, but each time you take a shot, you're having to move, right? Because presumably, were the cops watching you?
Well, they knew where I was. Every time I took a shot, the light illuminated where I was. And so I would have to like pull back and wait and for my camera to recharge again, my flash to recharge, and then move back in again, right? So it was very stressful. I mean, the whole thing was stressful to begin with, without having to deal with that on top of it.
Were the police trying to get hold of you and your camera each time the flash would go, or
no, not each time. No, I kind of, I'd seen the movie years ago, The Incredible Lightness of Being, and in that movie they waited and then they got the camera. And that kind of struck me when I was there, that isn't it strange they're not trying to get my camera now? And I thought, well, perhaps what they're doing is they want to get the photographs afterwards, after I've shot it, and then they could get it. And then they would have everything, right? They would also have photographs inside Sex Garage, which was an issue for me because I didn't want, people inside being identified either. So while I was shooting, I actually gave the film that I'd already shot to a friend of mine who was on a bicycle. He was amazing. Anyway, because he waited around. He knew that, I said, I'm going to have, probably give you, some more film or the camera at some point, right? So he waited around for me, and he had he had the other 2 rolls of film that I'd shot inside, and the first roll that I'd shot on the street, which also included the photographs of the police removing their identification. So I had before and after, which was good. But the very last photographs that I took, I guess the police had decided they'd had enough. And I was really close to what was going down because, people were being beaten just a few feet in front of me because the only lens that I had with me was a wide angle lens of 28. This is in analog terms. And, it's pretty wide. So if you want to see anything, you have to get pretty close up to what's going on. So anyway, I was photographing what seemed to me to be some of the worst violence that was going on. And it was, they were attacking friends of mine as well, which was very, disturbing to watch. And I was only a few feet away. And while I was photographing this, someone came up behind me, one of the cops, and someone who witnessed it told me what had happened because, when this happens to you, you're not really aware of what's happening. A cop came up behind me and he knocked my legs out from under me from the back of the knees. And then he hit me across the chest area where I'm holding the camera. So what I did was, as I was falling, I took the camera and I twisted my body towards the where people were running away up the hill, and I really had no choice at this point. It was like my Nikon, and precious Nikon, and I took my Nikon and I threw it along the ground up the hill, and I tried to do it in a way that it wouldn't, the back wouldn't open because that would have ruined the photographs, right? Because we're in analog days, you cannot open.
Especially those last good ones, right? That you just took.
Yeah, exactly. So what I did was I twisted around and I threw the camera up the hill, and I didn't even know if anyone could hear me because of all the commotion, but I shouted, "Grab the camera, run," like to whoever. Oh yeah, by the way, my flash had gone flying off. When he hit me, it dislodged my flash. My flash went flying into the gutter over to the right. My camera, I sent shooting to the left, and up the hill. And I waited for the cops to jump me because they were right there, and nothing happened. I mean, it may have been just a few seconds, but you expect it.
Time flies really quickly, right? In those moments.
Yeah. So anyway, I was, I had enough time to look up ahead thinking, oh my God, where's my camera? Who's got it? Right? Hopefully not a cop. And I saw this guy who I recognized as a journalist, a fellow journalist. And he was smiling at me. And I was thinking, why are you smiling? This is not exactly amusing, right? But he was smiling at me. And then he pointed to my camera strap, and it was a Mickey Mouse strap. It was pretty obvious, like he was pointing to it, and I recognized he had my camera, and I was so happy. Oh my God, So I went running towards him, and he did not want to have anything to do with my camera.
And the police went after the flash, didn't they?
I didn't wait around to see, but a friend of mine said about 3 cops. They all jumped on my flash, thinking they got my camera. So it was pretty obvious what they were after. If
that was a really smart move.
It was it was wonderful. But
like right out of a movie, kind of wonderful.
Yeah. Well, you know what? The whole thing felt like a bizarre movie, actually. But anyway.
So they've dived onto the wrong thing. You're getting out of Dodge, so to speak, away from harm's way.
Yeah. I knew they would be after me because they would know what I looked like. And then Daryl showed up on the bicycle, and I went, "Oh, thank you, Daryl." And I handed it to him, and he took off, and he said, "I'll meet you at home, like at your place." He knew where I lived, of course, because he's a friend of mine. And so I headed back home, and then he showed up, and he gave me back my camera.
So 4 a.m., I didn't go. I often went to those particular parties, but for whatever reason, I was tired. I didn't go out that night. So I was in bed when I get a phone call, a landline phone call from somebody who I know, basically saying there was a raid at the party. Folks are in jail. We need lawyers. What names and numbers can you supply me? So I did that.
Meantime, Linda Hammond and a friend rush on over to French-language newspaper La Presse with their negatives. Linda tells La Presse the whole story while they're waiting for the photos to be developed. Not realizing she was on the record, Linda was accidentally outed in La Presse the very next morning. Then, they ran on over to the offices of the Montreal Gazette, which almost turned it down. They said they had no space because of their coverage of the Oka crisis.
When I realized that they weren't going to publish it, or possibly, I said, what would really bother them was if we had 11 in front of Station 25, and I guess I realized that the media would jump on that. So I said, well, will you be there? I said this to my friend, and she said yes. And she said, I know somebody else who would. So we called up a girl that I didn't even know. And she said yes. So on the basis of myself, the person who accompanied me, and this unknown girl on the phone, I went to the Gazette people and I said, oh, by the way, did you know that we're having 11 in front of Station 25 tomorrow?
So you had to sell the Gazette on having to print the story and then tease them like, oh, by the way, we're going to go kiss in front of your cameras. That was it, though, right? It was like it was the temptation of having gay men and lesbians making out in their paper that sort of was like,
who can resist that, right?
Clickbait. Yeah. That's sort of like the clickbait of the 1990s, right?
Yes, exactly. And the Gazette response was, oh, well, there's going to be a follow-up. Well, in that case, we'll be there. And you don't have to organize anything. We'll arrange to contact all the media. They contacted all the media, and I didn't have to do a thing. The only thing I had to do was convince the gay community that they wanted to be there. And they didn't even know about it.
So how did that happen? How did that all come about?
That led to, in phone calls back and forth around legal help. By the morning, we had all decided that at 4 p.m. that day, so 12 hours or so after the initial raid, we were all going to convene in the bar, the women's bar that was on the ground floor of the building at Ontario and Saint Laurent. I think it was called Standing.
Well, there was a meeting that night at Standing, which was one of the only lesbian bars at the time in Montreal. But everybody was there from the gay community, and debating what to do next.
So we have a meeting to decide what to do. The decision is made to have a demonstration in the village that night to protest the initial 8 arrests.
And nobody really knew me in that community, except for my friends. So I had to kind of put up my hand at one point, and I said, as they were debating what to do next, and I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but I've promised the Gazette that we're going to have 11 in front of Station 25 tomorrow. and one young guy said, he was angry. He said, I don't want to do that. I'm angry. I don't want to make out. And I said, well, fact is that you don't have to make out, but I promised that we would be there and take advantage of it. All the press are going to be there. You can do what you want, when you get there. But that's, it's an opportunity, right?
For those keeping score, that's 2 protests Here's protest number 1.
Well, I don't know if you've heard, but cops raided a lesbian and gay party yesterday. They beat up a lot of lesbians without any reasons.
People responded with verbal chants. There was no physical attack on the police. We didn't menace them physically.
The cops are making gestures like gay men pretending to have limp wrists. Were giving us the finger. So if anyone's provoking anyone, it was very strange seeing that coming from cops.
I didn't go to that protest because I was sort of like, it didn't happen in the village. It's not those cops. It's not that location. Why are we all going there? I don't get it. So that demonstration happened that night, and essentially police came out and told the organizers of that, or the spokespeople of that event, it wasn't our station. It's not like, we didn't do that. We didn't arrest those people. We had nothing to do with that. So the next, again, word of mouth to the next day at noon, we have a protest kiss-in outside of the appropriate station.
And so I never really got any confirmation that anyone was going to be there the next day. So the next morning, when I got ready, I woke up and got ready to go, out, there with a few of my friends. And I was so surprised to see that many people. I think there were about 250 of us. At that, and everyone was milling about.
During all this time, our good friend Blaine was stuck in the loving care of Montreal Police. When he finally got out, he headed right on over to the next protest, still wearing the same outfit he had on at Sex Garage.
Oh my goodness, that was a rough night, and that was a rough morning because we were out in the sun and we did not have our shades or sunglasses. I don't remember having my sunglasses. It was rough. It was really rough.
So we meet there the next day.
People gathered in front of the police station
and hold a kiss-in.
And they just lay down on the ground.
We sort of sit down and link arms at this intersection.
I was in the third row. I had like these, there were these two leather guys on one side, and there was this young girl on the other side. And we were there, and we realized something was going wrong. And I gave my camera to a friend of mine who was waiting on the side.
By going wrong, was this referring to when the cops started to surround everybody?
Well, what they did was, they not only did they surround us, put on latex gloves to protect themselves from us because they thought we all had AIDS, right? And they sent word through our group so we would know. They told us that what they were their strategy was that they were going to take down the person beside you, and then, and they were going to hit us again. And they told us that, and we all knew. So anyone that stayed in that group with their arms linked heard that through word of mouth. It was very cruel. And I remember people had been really jovial about the whole thing, making out and saying, we're here, we're queer, we're fabulous, and we're here, we're queer, and so are some of you, and pointing at people they recognized from gay clubs who were cops, things like that, right? And then once we heard that they were going to do this to us, we could hardly believe they would do that in broad daylight, surrounded by all these witnesses, right?
Police show up on all sides.
And of course, there was more violence.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard Michael, Douglas, and maybe Paula try to get in. Maybe not Paula. So they try to get inside to speak with the cops and to have the charges dropped. And they ultimately would like some sort of table de consultation, so police will meet long-term with the community and develop better relations. That's sort of their mandate agenda at that point. And the police lock the doors so no one can get in. As they did at Sex Garage, many remove their badges. Many have latex gloves on, as they did at Sex Garage.
The feeling of fear was palpable. You felt like you were, like you were about to be slaughtered, like you were an animal about to be slaughtered. That's what it felt like. It was awful. And we started chanting, "Pas de violence, pas de violence."
They pull out their batons and they start to advance from all four sides.
And they just started taking us down one row by row.
And they're swinging. Silly point, I still literally have a scar on my knee from a billy club.
My arm was dislocated. My left shoulder was dislocated when they handcuffed me. I would have gone with them very, very easily. I would have let them handcuff me and bring me to the station.
That was protester Paul Curtin. He and hundreds of others were treated terribly and violently by Montreal police who were acting more like criminals. Here's their spokesperson, Jean-René Tremblay.
From what I've seen, the constable yesterday tried to minimize the use of strength. But still the people were joining themselves with their arm.
You heard that, right? The Montreal Police spokesperson said officers minimized their use of force. People had head injuries, broken bones, dislocations because of Montreal Police at a protest against police brutality.
It was weird. I don't think they had any real plan. They didn't really know what they were doing because personally I got lifted up by my arm, detached from who I was holding on to, lifted up by my arm by a police officer, dragged to a far corner away from the station. And we stood there. I didn't say it, like I didn't go willingly, but I didn't say a word or fight. I just sort of was like dead weight, if you will. And we stood there, and I don't think either of us knew what was going to happen next. He didn't know what to do. I didn't know what he was going to do.
You're talking about the police officer?
Yeah. He could have just let me go. He could have pushed me away. He could have told me to leave the space. He stood there, and then he decided he was going to bring me into the station and arrest me.
I was really afraid they're going to hit us in the face, and I just said to this girl beside me, I said, just don't look at them. Don't look at their faces, because they want us to be afraid. Just don't look at them, because you didn't want to look at them in fear.
I think there's a difference between the fear you're describing, but also the courage that you're exhibiting. I mean, you guys knew what was coming. These sons of bitches were coming in with billy clubs, and you guys sat there knowing.
Yeah.
I mean,
linked arm.
You can talk about fear all you like. I say that's courage. That's courage.
But we didn't want them to see us afraid. You know what I mean? That was really important. For me anyway. You know what I mean? And I felt so responsible for that young girl beside me because I was like, I was 33. I was a bit older, right? It doesn't sound old now, but at the time, she was probably like in her 20.
Here's Douglas Buckley Couvrette, Franco-Ontarian, student, co-founder of ACT UP Montreal, human rights activist, and a co-founder of Montreal's AIDS Memorial. He told media that the violence didn't stop for those who got dragged down to the station.
There was a lineup of police officers inside the door kicking people with their boots as they were being forcibly dragged and shoved into a cell in the station.
What do you think that Montreal Police spokesperson Jean-René Tremblay said about all that?
I was in the station at the second story, and as far as I know, there was nothing inside of the station.
They're lying. They're covering up.
That second voice you heard is Edward Cook. He spoke to Pulse News reporter Anne Shatilla about the police violence from his hospital bed. He was recovering from a cop-inflicted groin injury.
I saw that police officers were beating other protesters. I stood up to try to walk into the cell, and the police officer who was dragging me into the station threw me onto the floor, kicked me twice in the back, once on the shoulder, once in my lower spine. Then he turned me over and struck me twice in the groin with his nightstick. And immediately after that, two other police officers picked me up, threw me against walls, and threw me into the cell with the other protesters.
Were they beating people inside the police office?
Yes, well, Edward Cook, he got attacked inside. He got dragged in by his feet, smiling and blowing kisses to the cops, and that was all over the news, that scene.
There was that young man, and I can see him in front of me, but I've forgotten his name. It starts with an E. I guess it's Edward. He was brought in.
As soon as he got inside, they started hammering him, and he almost lost his testicle.
I know that they gave him a really strong billy club smack in his genitals, and because then they threw him into the cell with us. He was also in that sort of holding cell area after the main thing happened, and he was in
agony,
excruciating pain. He was doubled over, agony, exactly.
We heard everyone was upset because people were witnessing this,
and we were all. I was sort of screaming out of the door. He needs medical attention. You can't just leave him here. And eventually
But they did leave him there. They let him stay there until the media got away.
He was left on the stretcher for 20 minutes while the police officers waited for the press to disperse.
Well, what they did was they left him there for a long time. Then they strapped him into a gurney and they left him in the central area on a gurney.
And they waited. The police waited until the media had left the front of the building before they called the ambulance, because he had been seen being dragged in fine, and they didn't want the next scene him being taken out in an ambulance.
I think in the end they dragged him out a back door where the media wasn't.
Cook says police spent the time after the altercation laughing and joking about how many times they had struck protesters. He also says they didn't want the public to be aware of how many protesters were injured.
There was this one woman that came in and she had a footprint, a cop boot on her face, like the imprint of the dirt from his boot, because she had tried to protect her girlfriend. And, when they got in, because and she had bruises on her arms. And I was looking at myself thinking, wow, I only had a bruise where they hit me from the matraque, right? And I thought, Jesus, compared to some of these other people, they were being kind of careful with me because they knew who I was.
Because of the photos and everything, right?
I knew they knew who I was because they actually kept coming to the cell to confront me in the cell, saying things like, "Oh, you're the media star."
We got the attention of the media, which is what we wanted. And that way that didn't go down undocumented, because like Stonewall, part of the success of Stonewall was the fact that the abuse and the prejudice and everything was documented, so that even now today we can go back and just talk about it.
I hope this episode gets folks talking about it. It's why we don't want uniformed police marching in pride parades, because more than 30 years after the Sex Garage raid, and since the 2017 official apology from then-Mayor Denis Coderre and former police chief Philippe Pichet for all of the homophobic injustice and violence, Montreal police and city bureaucrats still don't respect our community, as you'll hear in another episode. What gays and lesbians succeeded in doing, though, was to expose police bullying and bigotry and homophobic violence to the whole city, aimed not at deviants or perverts or sexual predators, but at young women and men, coffee shop employees and store clerks, lifeguards, in other words, people's kids. Montrealers were shocked when they saw police beating up their children and grandchildren on the evening news. And at a news conference held at the Gay and Lesbian Community Centre the next day, more activism supporting queer civil rights in Quebec was getting started.
We're talking about going to the Quebec Human Rights Commission, possibly an investigation by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. These things have yet to be concretely determined, but we are on our way to do something. We are not going to sit back and let nothing happen.
Can we touch on the press conference that you did with Douglas after Sex Garage? You were at the front of the room speaking to media and taking questions and things. Like, how important was that for the community in sort of setting a tone as to what our demands and expectations were?
I don't know. I mean, this is obviously a real turning point for you, and I don't know that it is that. Like, I don't know if it registers that way for me. It was something that needed to be done, and we did it.
Why don't you view it as a turning point?
I don't know. I think, like I said, it was sort of like we needed a woman and a man and bilingual, and it was very like technical or
it's technical. It was technical from your level on the other side of the microphone of like organizing. But take a step back and look at what has just happened. You and Douglas were speaking on behalf of every queen in the city and every lesbian and everyone who had been treated like shit by the establishment. And at that point, we had just had, the Joe Rose murder. We'd had the conference. We had the ongoing violence. There was a series of murders that we had a serial killer in our own city. This happens, but and then finally we stood up, and you stood up, and everyone stood up and said, "Fuck you, Montreal Police. This stops today." And then the next thing you know, we've got hearings for the province. So like you were part of a major turning point in this province. I can't underscore that enough. Shit could not have been getting any more real for our community as it was right where you were holding the steering wheel.
Yeah, I mean, we were angry and we were fed up. That's obviously true. We were just done. And it felt like, for the first time that I could remember, it felt like other people could see that.
And that kind of led to a whole bunch of things over the next 3 or 4 years in Montreal.
That included taking the queer community's grievances against Montreal Police to the Quebec Human Rights Commission, which, among other things, called out police for their repression of Montreal's gay community. There was the fight to create Montreal's AIDS Memorial, which I'll tell you about in another episode of this series. There was the battle for equal marriage, and many more. This episode was researched, written, recorded, and produced by me, Shawn Dearn. Executive producer, Ian Capstick. Coming up in the next episode of Queer Legends, an oral history podcast, I speak with Greg Malone about being one of the first out performers on Canadian television and what it was like growing up gay in Newfoundland and Labrador. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you go for great storytelling.